VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And welcome to Crosstalk here on VCY America. My name is Jim Schneider, and ladies and gentlemen, you know the stories that are going on in today's news are very numerous. Today, most of the children in Newtown, Connecticut went back to school. Funerals were held for 2 more victims today. More funerals planned throughout the week. There's renewed debate going on, calls for gun control. Others are pushing to allow teachers to carry in the schools. Other news indicates the impasse of discussions and debate that's regarding this fiscal cliff issue, and knowing that there are fundamental differences between the major players and the American people. Well, we're just kind of left to hold on during this roller coaster ride. Another lawsuit's been filed against the mandates of Obamacare, and over half the states have refused to set up a state exchange. And while all these matters are going on, there's been yet another issue that's been brewing this year, and that is a money laundering scheme of international proportions involving one of the largest banks in the world that allegedly runs into the billions of dollars. Well, following that story, during 2012 is Dr. Jerome Corsi. He received his Ph.D. from Harvard. He's a senior staff reporter for WND. He's authored many books, including The Obama Nation, Unfit for Command, and Where is the Real Birth Certificate? Dr. Corsi, thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Before we get into this story that you've been following through this year, the money laundering scheme that's been going on, give us your reaction to what we saw take place in Newtown, Connecticut.
Well, I mean, of course, the first thing is it's a horrible tragedy, and a number of reflections. I mean, first of all, I think the only way we're going to prevent these is to target harden our schools as free gun zones, merely invite crazies who know that there's virtually no way they can get retaliation at them. I mean, this is, a free gun zone means free shooting zone.
Yeah, just the bad guys can have them.
Bad guys are going to have them, and any number of these incidents, when people are armed, these incidents don't go anywhere. Secondly, I think an unreported or underreported aspect of the story is going to be the meds, and even if they now say this kid was off his meds, that's almost as bad as being on the meds. The relationship between these drugs that are being given in psychiatric settings and violence is astounding. And I've interviewed 2 psychiatrists who say there's just no doubt that these drugs do produce violent behavior. You've got a kid here who is withdrawn, who is highly intelligent in his own world, an old violent world of video games and violent video games, and basically has no God, no family. I mean, if you went into that school and tried to say a prayer, you'd be shut down faster than the shooter was shut down.
Yeah.
And this is, again, if we have a world, and a secular world, in which God is not prevented, evil is not discussed, salvation, other key concepts that have been fundamental to the formation of human conscience and morals for 2,000 years, we're eradicating from our school and public squares. And if we do that, there's going to be consequences. Among the consequences are going to be a secular world in which there is, these drugs eliminate conscience, these drugs numb people, produce violent behavior, and divorced family, a school that is totally secular. All these environments are such that they're going to be very dangerous future environments in which to live in. And I think, we ought to go back and think through the elements of putting God back into schools, putting God back into society, not just when there's a tragedy and everybody rushes to church.
Mm-hmm.
But, if God's not allowed in the front door, it's hard to see how God's going to be involved or merciful or forgiving in these incidents that occur in a secular society such as we've created.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Corsi, as we've covered this story, of course, quite a bit the last couple of days here on Crosstalk, our hearts continue to go out to the families involved with this, and certainly, listeners, we encourage you to continue to be praying for the families, the hurt, the time of loss that they are going through, and certainly be praying that many come to a saving faith of Jesus Christ, in Jesus Christ, as a result. Dr. Corsi, throughout this year of 2012, as all these different issues are going on, we know that this fiscal cliff talk thing is going on as well, but you've been following a story as well throughout this year that involves a banking giant accused of money laundering, and we're talking about HSBC. Let's kind of start at the beginning. Who or what is HSBC?
HSBC is a Hong Kong, Shanghai banking corporation. And Shanghai, it's a bank that is headquartered in China in terms of originated in China. The holding company today is now in London, HSBC Holdings Limited. And the bank is really in dozens of countries all over the world. It's one of the biggest banks in the world. And as such, it has the ability to operate with transfers within the bank from one country to another without having to go outside of the bank on international wire transfers. It's a bank that's ideally set up for money laundering across country lines.
And we understand that there was a former employee, working for them at the time, who became a whistleblower, producing about 1,000 pages of customer account records. What were the allegations? What was discovered?
Well, John Cruz came to me in early in 2012, and he brought with him, he'd been trying to get news agencies to pay attention to him, and no one would. He brought 1,000 pages of customer accounts with him, and I started looking at them, and I realized I'd spent 25 years working in bank marketing around the world. I've worked very closely with banks over that time, that part of my career, and I realized I was looking at customer accounts that were created, first of all, by stealing someone's Social Security number, creating a bogus account, and then running millions of dollars through that account in a very quick period of time. After a few months, the account would be closed down and the electronic record of it gone. I determined all this by calling some customers and basically saying, I remember one gentleman in New York, about 85 years old, I said, look, is this your Social Security number? Well, he's astounded I had his Social Security number. I said, the bank, HSBC, is running, do you know it's running millions of dollars through your accounts? And it turned out he didn't know he had any of those accounts. This gentleman thought that I was the problem. He was going to turn his lawyer on me. We sent his lawyer all the documentary evidence so that the lawyer could settle it out with the bank. But the point is, you have a situation in which it's a rogue bank operating in unless John Cruz had brought this documentation out, I don't think anyone would have believed it.
Now, he actually started his own investigation, didn't he?
Yes, John Cruz was a relationship manager. He worked at the bank in Long Island. His job was to go find commercial accounts that the bank had and visit those accounts and sell additional banking products and services. And so he started by going and seeing these accounts and finding out that there was no business there, or the business that was there was only one or two people, and it didn't represent anything of what the documentation, the paperwork said that the business was going to be. It was all fraudulent. And then when John got back to the bank and started asking his managers and supervisors about these accounts, they told him not to bother with them, to forget about those accounts, and to go look at others. So he knew from the beginning, from his own first-hand investigation, John Cruz knew that this was a fraudulent situation. He wasn't sure what was going on, but then as he researched these accounts in the bank computer system and made copies, because later the documentation was gone or he was denied access to look up these accounts. He was able to produce 1,000 pages of documentation, which 100% prove what he's alleging.
Well, so in essence, I mean, he was doing his job by establishing these relationships, and then certainly his higher-ups had to know that what they were involved in was not accurate.
Yeah, well, that's the shocking part about, the first shocking part about the story was that the corruption was rampant throughout the bank. That bank officers down to the branch level know that it is one of those situations where it only could occur with the branch management and of the staff at that branch being involved, and then that can only occur with the regional, the divisional, and ultimately the chairman's office being involved, because you can't just take hundreds of accounts and make them up and have your bank employees running millions of dollars through these accounts without somebody in the bank recognizing it. That's the whole job of bank compliance. And that bank compliance knew nothing about it, or said they knew nothing about it, and then did nothing about it when John brought it to their attention, is again further evidence that this was a corruption culture in which the bank officers were actively participating.
And we understand that John was not too late, much later, fired for what they called poor performance?
Right. John was told to stop looking at these accounts. He was told to stop investigating it, stop asking questions. He ultimately took to wearing a wire so he could record his conversations with the bank employees and document what he was saying, namely that they knew or were confronted by him with the information, and that yet they would not take action or would not affirm what they knew, what he was showing them, namely that there was this kind of fraudulent activity in the bank going on.
Now, I understand somewhere about this time that there was a Senate subcommittee that started a probe. What's the connection there? Well,
the Senate had been evidently looking at H.S.B.C. for some time, but when I published these articles, the Senate subcommittee called me, and I offered to share the information. Of course, this put pressure on the Senate because the Senate couldn't just sweep it all under the rug. And I also got called by the Department of Homeland Security, and with John's permission, I went in, and John by telephone, and we turned over the 1,000 pages of documentation, plus the MP3s, the audio tapes John had made of all these conversations with bank employees. We turned them over to the Department of Homeland Security, and John turned them subsequently over to the IRS. So we got this information in the hands of law enforcement that could do something about it. And John, first of all, he didn't think any news agency would cover it. He wasn't getting the attention of law enforcement. And then when WND published the stories, it kind of forced the issue on the public scene. That's only when, I think, really active government scrutiny began.
Well, folks, we're going to take a quick pause here in our discussion because what's transpired since is absolutely amazing. But here we're talking about employees that were actually working with these fictitious and fraudulent accounts. We'll find out more about its purpose and some of the connections to some very horrendous actions as well. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, Noah's Ark researcher at the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, how could Noah's Ark have survived the turmoil of the flood?
Chris, Noah's flood was a terrible catastrophe, more dynamic and deadly than any other catastrophe before or since. We see evidence in the geologic record that there were 1,000-feet-high tsunamis during the flood, and we see evidence of dynamic underwater mud flows. We see the continents separating rapidly, causing untold havoc and no doubt giant waves. If the ark had not been supernaturally designed and continually protected by God, it could not have survived. But it was God's will for it to survive. God extended His grace and mercy and caused Noah and the ark to land on the mountains of Ararat and begin the new world. Chris, the supernatural protection of God is all over the flood story. We read all about it when we go back to Genesis.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. For more information, visit us on the web at icr.org. I'm Chris O'Brien. Thanks for tuning in.
You're listening to Crosstalk here on VCY America. We're speaking with Dr. Jerome Corsi today, senior staff reporter for WND, regarding banking giant HSBC accused of money laundering and some very horrendous things going on here where we have employees that are working with these fictitious accounts, fraudulent accounts. John Cruz, an employee who going about to establish relationships with the accounts, discovers, hey, something's wrong here, takes it to his superiors, who in turn tell him, don't worry about this. We find later he was terminated because of what was called, quote, poor performance. A subcommittee from the U.S. Senate is involved in a probe here at this point. Law enforcement has been made aware of this, Department of Homeland Security and others. What was the result, Dr. Corsi, of the law enforcement? You turned these things over. I'm guessing you kept copies of them.
We kept copies. We turned everything over to law enforcement and asked them to investigate. Law enforcement took the information, but I'm not sure what they did with it. The problem is, again, you give all this information to law enforcement. They say, thank you very much. You go your merry way. And then whether they've ever done anything with it or not, you have no control over.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem is that, we went for months and months and never heard a thing was going on. John and I were constantly wondering whether, there was going to be any action taken, whether there was going to be anybody following up. And you could not get Homeland Security to say what they were doing, or IRS.
Did the subcommittee come up with anything?
Well, what happened was the subcommittee came up with a report that they released, I believe in July, and it was 334 pages long, and it documented the types of things that we were saying. It documented the money laundering that was going on in the bank, a massive level, billions of dollars, and the Senate Permanent Subcommittee attributed the money laundering to money for the drug cartels in Mexico. The bank HSBC was laundering money for terrorists in conjunction with Saudi Arabia, and HSBC was utilizing bank illegal money facilities to circumvent sanctions. The U.S. government had banking sanctions the U.S. government had on Iran, as we were trying to force Iran not to develop nuclear weapons. So, this was a tremendous amount of criminal activity.
Absolutely.
Terrorists, drug cartels, Iran, and the bank is at the center of it, operating, with a major presence in the United States, especially in New York City, Long Island.
Some would say that would be treasonous.
I would think so. It certainly indicated a complete disregard for the national security interests of the United States. And then the next thing that happens is that about a week or so ago, the Department of Justice announces that they've got a $2 billion settlement with HSBC. HSBC agrees to pay this fine, and it's in lieu of criminal prosecution. So, again, $2 billion is a lot of money, but this is a bank that has maybe $2.6 trillion in assets. The shareholders pay the fine. In other words, the bank, instead of making $22 billion in profits, will make $20 billion in profits. And none of the officers or directors or anybody involved in all this criminal activity has any prosecution or any criminal risk, no loss of bonus, no financial penalty, no loss of salary, and they're not fired.
That's not even a slap on the wrist.
It's a go-free card. It's a cover-up.
The whistleblower, John Cruz, called it a joke.
A joke. And you can see why he called it a joke. When John first started talking to me, I went back to my notes, going back to the first part of this year. John told me the bank had, for at least a year, maybe 2 years, reserved $2 billion to pay this fine. Now, somehow John and the bank both knew the fine was going to be $2 billion, which was almost the exact amount. The fine was $1.92 billion. And the bank had reserved that for years. In other words, the bank had put that money aside, was prepared to pay the fine. HSBC must have considered it just the cost of doing business. that laundering all this money, there were literally billions and billions being made, hundreds of billions probably being laundered around the world. So what's a $22 billion fine?
Some are calling this a cover-up. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. Because the criminal prosecutions would have permitted us to find out who in the federal government could have been involved. In other words, it's very hard to imagine that billions were being laundered for the drug cartels in Mexico by HSBC and the terrorists, Islamic terrorists working with Saudi Arabia. And none of our banking authorities knew. The Treasury didn't know, Federal Reserve didn't know, nor the intelligence agencies. Nobody picked it up in CIA or picked it up in NSA, National Security Agency. NSA is supposed to be able to read our emails. I mean, what it makes you believe, and I've gone back to, there was a journalist named Gary Webb who wrote a book in the 90s called Dark Alliance, and Gary was documenting then that the Iran-Contra affair, that the Contras were raising a lot of their money to fight in Nicaragua by selling cocaine in the United States, and it was being done with the complicity of the federal government.
So these types of transactions that were going on with HSBC, these are actually transactions that should have been reported to the government, shouldn't they have?
Well, yes. I mean, first of all, if you come into the bank or I come into the bank with more than $10,000 in cash, we're about treated as a criminal. There's all kinds of forms we have to fill out. But if you're a drug cartel, the problem is that it's a cash business, and $1 billion of $100 bills doesn't do you a lot of good. How many semi-trucks do you need to drive it around? Mm-hmm. But if you can drive it into Tijuana and pull up at your local HSBC and, get served some espresso while the bank counts the money and hands you a passbook or an electronic statement of the money and burns the money, suddenly it's worthwhile. Then you can move the money anywhere you want to go in the world.
Dr. Corsi, is it true that PayPal and American Express were used as conduits for these transactions?
Yes. Many of the money, unbelievable. We're looking at this. Here's PayPal and American Express being used, money going, out to them that is then transferred who knows where. Same with PayPal, being used as payout facilities for these accounts. And why they were used, we could never track it down with PayPal or with American Express. They would never answer our inquiries. But we could see in the bank statements where PayPal and American Express showed up with great regularity. And, it makes you realize that when there's billions of dollars involved, again, the greed factor allows many of these organizations, including probably the federal government, to not only turn a blind eye, but probably to encourages them to participate in the scheme.
Now, these bank officers and directors, allegedly nothing has happened to them. It's a financial fine, in essence, that they have to pay a settlement. What's to keep them from continuing the racket?
Absolutely nothing. They could continue the racket as much as they wanted to, and again, shift it or slightly do it differently. How would you ever know unless you had a John Cruz in there that was monitoring it? See, that was the frightening thing of what John Cruz was bringing out. John Cruz was proving with the audio tapes he'd made of discussions with the bank security officers that bank compliance was part of turning a blind eye. Bank compliance had no interest at all in making sure the bank was following money laundering laws. Now, that alone should have put some bank compliance officers in prison. I mean, their job is to enforce the laws. I mean, passing the Patriot Act, all these acts, you can't money launder, you run drug money, you can't run terrorist money, and HSBC completely ignores all those laws and regulations and runs a massive billions and billions and billions of dollars of money laundering using customer identity theft to set up the accounts.
And the identity theft, the Social Security numbers, these were just innocent people who had an account at one point with HSBC?
Right. HSBC knew what their Social Security numbers were, so they either had current accounts or previous accounts, and HSBC just used their legitimate Social Security numbers to set up these accounts through which HSBC then laundered billions of dollars, ultimately, moving the money into the accounts and withdrawing that amount from the accounts almost simultaneously within the month. So these accounts always ended up with net zero balances.
So what does this do to the public's confidence in the banking industry?
Well, I mean, it makes you realize that, we are the drug cartels. It's not like there's somebody separate. The banks in our midst are running the drug money. They are running the drug cartel business for them. The accountants and everything from the drug industry, from the cartels in Mexico, turned to H.S.B.C. for a reconciliation of their interest earnings.
Wow.
It's pathetic. And so do the terrorists. Known terrorists using these facilities at HSBC to move money in and out of Saudi Arabia to conduct their terrorist activities around the world.
Dr. Jerome Corsi is with us today. Dr. Corsi, you also were fired by a New York City investment firm. What's the connection?
Well, I was managing director at Guilford Securities. It's a private firm. When I started publishing these articles, the first ones, the chairman, who had hired me knowing I was a journalist, had liked my work and admired my work. I've been in securities. I've had securities licenses for well over 20 years. And he came into my office and said, "Look, you can't write these articles on money laundering and HSBC. It's just too close to it's too close to financial services. You can't expose HSBC." And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, I've done all kinds of agreements with the NASD and all the other regulatory agencies that I take tests understanding the money laundering laws and agreeing to enforce them in the securities business. And part of that is if you see any suspicious activity, you're supposed to report it. Now, that's what I was doing, reporting it publicly and also bringing the information into the authorities like the Department of Homeland Security and IRS and the Senate, and being reprimanded for it, fired. I said, "Well, you can't work here." So, I basically agreed that we would just do it as a voluntary or downsizing. I mean, I did not resign, but at the same time, it wasn't a firing. There was no disciplinary action, or when they filled out the forms, it was simply put down as a reduction in force or something of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
But it was not possible to continue working at that securities firm after I was writing these articles on HSBC.
Wow. Folks, we're going to talk more about this settlement here and the international reaction that's going to it right now. And also we're going to take a look at how this impacts you and me. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
We are living in a world where truth is diluted to each man's opinion, and faith is assembled from a smorgasbord of self-help varieties. In the book Buyer Beware, author Janet Parshall draws a parallel from the classic work The Pilgrim's Progress to show that the message of truth cannot be bought and sold like a commodity, but must be lived out by believers in the public square. She examines some of the most controversial issues being debated in our culture today by looking at them through the lens of Scripture. She also uses the prophet Jeremiah's letter to show how a people held in a sin-fallen world can live abundantly and triumphantly. The book is designed to encourage modern-day saints as they enter the marketplace by helping them discover the richness of God's Word and the poverty of the world's message. Buyer Beware is available for a donation of $18 or more to VCY America by calling 1-800-729-9829. That's toll-free, 1-800-729-9829.
folks, some amazing issues going on here as evidence suggests that HSBC had pursued a policy of exploiting and defrauding customers in the developing world to support illegal profits obtained in the developed world by working money launderers, terrorists, organized criminals, corrupt public officials perhaps, and others. We're talking about these issues here today with Dr. Jerome Corsi of WND.com, and I would commend you to reading the stories that have been covered since about February this year on this matter. But Dr. Corsi, you mentioned that this settlement came out, I think it was last week, a $1.92 billion settlement with the Justice Department. We have the whistleblower John Cruz calling it a joke. There are nations, this is an international banking firm, and there are other nations that are also rising up regarding that settlement. What are we hearing from them?
Well, I've been contacted both by people in India and in the UK who have their own grievances against HSBC. And they're aware of these issues that we reported on. But again, in India, the bank has been really cheating retail customers. What they've done is they had a scam where people of Indian descent living in London, investing back in India, were defrauded of their money, signing blank investment authorities to the officers of HSBC, who then proceeded to whittle away their funds. And the bank, it seems to me, has got a criminal profile around the world. As you look at this bank, it's a bank that, in fact, has many, many instances and many, many ways and reasons for people wanting to essentially come after this bank for criminal charges. And the calls are for criminal prosecution not only at the nation level, like the officers in the United States and managers in the United States, but also at the level of the holding company in Great Britain. Because, again, this bank is being managed internationally, and the people who are at the top need to be responsible for the illegality the bank is engaging in around the world.
What government agency here in the U.S. would oversee this?
Well, it should be several. You have the Federal Reserve and the Treasury each oversee different aspects of banking. The SEC may be involved, certainly, in any securities transactions going on through the banks. FDIC, there's losses being taken. The bank officers even started making loans to these fraudulent companies. And then the money was stolen, the account was closed, and the loan was considered to be a loan in default that was charged off again to the shareholders or ultimately to the taxpayer if the loan showed up in negative losses in the reserves of the bank. So, again, all these government agencies were just turning a blind eye to the money laundering activity that HSBC was engaging in and not tracking the accounts, not finding the activity.
Bring it down to where we live here today, 2012 in the United States. How does this impact us?
Well, it impacts in a number of ways. First of all, it's a double standard. If you're a big enough criminal, a drug cartel, the bank will roll out a red carpet for you and allow you to drive your truck full of $100 bills from drug transactions, and they'll illegally launder those for you and put them into the system. If you're a small business operating, that's where the money laundering, Patriot Act and the other laws we've passed, you'll get caught. You get caught if you do cash transactions or come in with too much cash or do anything out of the ordinary. They'll catch the small business guys and women out there because they want their taxes. They don't. They'll go all over anybody who is not big enough in the world of banking in order to command millions and millions of dollars of fees or hundreds of billions of dollars of transactions. Once you get to that level, you can do about anything you want with impunity, it looks like. Maybe pay some fines eventually, but none of the cartel officers or anybody else paid any fines here. They weren't even identified.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically it means that you're operating in a double standard. That the law enforcement's going to come down hard on you as a individual, and you'll be operating in a criminal environment where the bank is operating in a double standard. Probably the bank officers you're dealing with making money on the side from illegal money laundering activities. They're supervising in the bank.
Yeah. Dr. Corsi, this $1.92 billion fine,
right?
That's with the U.S. government, correct?
Yes, will be paid to probably through the Department of Justice to the Treasury.
Okay. Now, what about other nations? India, London. Can they also bring charges against, investigate, and seek to do what the U.S. failed to do?
They might if they could figure out where the money went. See, in a lot of the transactions we had from John Cruz, we could see the money leaving the account, but we didn't know where it ended up. So you'd have to be able to get customer accounts. Now, that was the unique thing about what John had, is he copied, as a bank employee, he copied out of the bank computer accounts that he knew to be fraudulent before he was fired.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're in the bank, the problem is knowing which accounts are fraudulent, because you've got so many thousands, if not millions, of accounts that, it's a overwhelming problem to be able to search through them. Now, you could write computer algorithms and you could search for this, but the bankers are also clever enough to not let these accounts stay in effect very long. So after they are open for a certain period of time or have a certain amount of money run through these accounts, these fraudulent accounts, the criminal bankers close those accounts, and there's no record that they ever existed.
So in essence, we have the U.S. government saying, tell you what, we're going to close our eyes to this. We're not going to pursue further investigations. Just help us a little bit get off this fiscal cliff by putting $1.92 billion into our Treasury funds here.
Right, it was about 25 minutes of running the federal government.
Well, couldn't we suspend the bank's license to operate in the U.S.?
Sure. Could definitely suspend the bank's license. You could fine or criminally charge employees at all levels. You could go after the board of directors. There's many things you could do. Make public the specific nature of the offenses, trace to see if there was any government officials involved in the scheme, identify and make public the names of the outside entities for whom the money was being laundered. All this could be done. But again, so far, the U.S. federal government has done none of this.
Let's open our phone lines today. Our number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829, 800-733-9829. Folks, does this shake your confidence in the banking industry? Does it shake your confidence in our federal government and in the regulators, those who are to oversee these issues? Our number, 800-733-9829. 9829. Well, now that the settlement came forth last week and was announced, does that kind of make it over and done? Is there anything people can do? I mean, what more can be done?
Well, again, that's part of the problem, is that once the settlement is done and paid, I don't expect it could be opened up again, as this was a settlement in lieu of prosecution. Now, there may be some laws under which you could crack that open and indicate that this was a criminal scheme itself to agree to the settlement by the federal government, but you would have to then go after the federal government officials that agreed to this settlement and agreed not to prosecute the HSBC bank officers.
Dr. Corsi, again, give us a website where our listeners can get a lot of information on this issue.
WND.com. I'm a senior staff reporter at WND, which was WorldNet Daily. Now we just go by WND.com.
And folks, check out the story there. It's rather astounding. And I see the lines are all filled up here today on Crosstalk. Let me just ask you this before we pick up our first call. How is it? I mean, we know identity theft has taken place here. How do these customers who've been victimized, defrauded, how do they get their good name back?
You'll never know. I mean, you make a credit statement at some point, or somebody might ask what all this billions of dollars was doing going through an account. that was named to you, but mostly the criminals in the bank tried to do it so there was never a positive balance and nothing would ever show up on tax reporting or credit reporting.
Let's begin in Navarre, Florida. And Rick, go ahead. You're on the air.
Yes, good afternoon, and congratulations to Mr. Corsi for doing some fine journalistic sleuthing once again. I have a question about what happened when this material, the evidence, finally reached the Senate Banking Committees. Undoubtedly, the Senate Banking Committee itself, and also its subcommittees. Since these committees, of course, are constituted of both Democrats and Republicans, and there had to be a number of votes involved as this thing progressed its way, through the labyrinth of subcommittees and committees, there were many votes. Was there a bipartisan effort on the part of both the Democrats and the Republicans to slough this thing through? In other words, was there bipartisanship in covering this thing up? Or was it a party line deal where the Democrats were the ones doing the covering up?
No, I think it was bipartisan. I don't think any of I certainly never encountered any congressmen or senators on either side of the aisle that wanted to take up these questions and make them public. There's a general rush to cover it all up.
So here we have the lawmakers refusing to enforce the law.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's true.
That's where we are. This is a really sad state of affairs.
Yeah.
The rod is right at the top.
I mean, and saying this is money laundering for drug cartels and terrorists, and Iran developing nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that's why I use the term treasonous.
Yeah, how you couldn't get more important issues for national security than these three.
Rick, thanks for the call today. Let's go to Edward in Milwaukee. You're on the air, Edward.
Hello. I've got a Menards credit card that is HSBC Retail Services. I'm wondering how this affects the consumer that has a card through them.
Usually it's separate from the cards. I mean, I've had some complaints of credit card scams being run by HSBC. Certainly, interest rate issues are very questionable by many customers. But I haven't found illegalities in the credit cards. It's mostly been in the, these accounts, the deposit accounts, where the money has been laundered. That's been the offenses we've found.
Mm-hmm.
How about appealing to Menards to maybe lose HSBC because of their actions?
Well, I think pressure on HSBC around the country would be a good idea, and to get accountability. I mean, it's a criminal bank, and I have no confidence that the bank won't just simply pick up these activities where they left off, maybe in a different form.
Edward, thanks for your call here today. We're just seconds away from the break, so I'm going to just hold off our next call until after the 60-second break. So, Ron, hang on in Pennsylvania, and John there in Ohio, and others online right now. We're talking with Dr. Jerome Corsi today from WND.com, senior staff reporter, and taking a look at a banking giant accused of money laundering and a settlement reached just last week. We'll be back in just 1 minute. You're listening to Crosstalk.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewweekend.com. In our last commentary, I shared with you some of the fruits of repentance: a desire for holiness, a hatred of sin, a fear of God, humility because we know what we deserve, a zeal for the gospel and for truth, a hatred of false teaching, compassion for the lost, a love of God's word, and a love of other believers. Now let me share with you a few more. How about a life marked more by obedience than disobedience, a desire to protect the church and the gospel, a willingness to suffer for the gospel, and a hope that cannot be described by the world, a hope in the midst of persecution. And indeed, 2 Timothy 3:12 says, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. Are you showing forth the fruit of biblical repentance? Because we are told in the Scriptures that there must be a fruit that comes from repenting. Jonah 3:10 speaks to that issue. God sees our works are the fruit of our repentance. For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House.
You know, folks, this is truly an amazing story here as we see this money laundering. I mean, we've got terrorist organizations, Mexican drug cartels, and in essence, not even a slap on the wrist in this regard. We're taking your calls here today at Crosstalk. Our guest, Dr. Jerome Corsi from WND.com, a senior staff reporter. Let's go to Mansfield, Pennsylvania. Ron, thank you for your patience. You're on the air.
Okay, wonderful program. And as a retired federal agent, when I was working, I developed an informant, and we kind of squeezed him a little bit because we got him on a lesser charge, and he said, I got something to give you. And you are right on the mark. I was in Boston, and two of the major banks there were routinely laundering money for the organized crime. I was on the organized crime team. Laundry bags of cash every day, and they took 20% off the top.
Right. And
when we finally squeezed them and moved on them, both banks signed consent agreements,
right.
Paid a fine, but acknowledged no guilt.
Right.
And I said, why did I work weekends and nights in my surveillance vans, taking videos and photographs? They signed consent agreements, and Dr. Corsi, you got it right on the mark. Consent agreements are the ticket out back to where they were.
Wow.
And the bank officers themselves don't pay the fines. The fines are paid by the shareholders.
Ron, thanks for bringing that up, but it's disturbing, Dr. Corsi, to seem, just to hear of another incident to this going on as well.
I think it's pervasive.
John in Columbus, Ohio, you're on the air.
How you doing?
Fine.
I want to make a point that I've been trying to make to this society for about 7 years now. And it's a point that explains why the watchdogs who are supposed to be seeing this type of corruption, overseeing it, continue to be corrupt themselves, and why we cannot trust any individual or any organization on the planet to handle these types of affairs without becoming corrupt. It's a point that I make at this point purely out of frustration, because I have zero faith in the society to correct the problem or even acknowledge it. The reason we continue to see more profound and more common examples of corruption in every industry and every government, every town, every city, is because we are flaunting, we are promoting, we have been celebrating the very concept of extreme wealth. It corrupts the mind. And there is not a person on this planet who can keep their soul and grasp the concept of extreme personal wealth at the same time, because it corrupts the individual without question.
Well, one thing we do know, John, is that it is the love of money that is the root of all kinds of evil. And certainly we have borne witness of what that can do. Certainly where our treasure is, there will our heart be also. And certainly having eternity's values and views is vitally important. But it is not the funds themselves. It is the love of those things that certainly brings corruption. Thank you so much for your comment here.
And it's also, I think, the loss of God. Our founding fathers warned, you can't have morals, you can't have liberty, you can't have laws that are going to be obeyed and enforced unless there's a belief in God.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that as well here with the school shooting that we began with at the top of the program, too. We push God out from every aspect of society, and we secularize everything around us and want no part of God, and then we wonder why there's corruption around us.
All the morals are just situational from that point on.
The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Pensacola, Florida. Michael, you're on the air.
Yes, sir. I'd like to ask this question. How long had this problem been going on in the banking industry, as far as corruption-wise, with laundering money and whatnot? Is there a year we put a thumbprint on?
It's been going on for, at least, I can answer HSBC, it's been going on, for more than a decade, because we saw the evidence of it operating that long. It's become, I think, endemic in banking. I think it's certainly with HSBC, the culture was criminal culture, and there was the bank. Even when these issues were brought to the attention of the bank compliance officers, they wanted to sweep it under the rug. They did not want to take John Cruz seriously. They fired John Cruz for bringing this information persistently to their attention.
Let me ask one question. Why is it that if I go to a bank and try to secure a loan, and I got to have collateral, and I'm going to be charged like maybe from 15 to 20% interest in borrowing money, and I go to that same bank and open up a savings account, and at the most I may get is 1 or 2% interest rate. Why is that so lopsided like that?
Well, and again, those are different issues. Those are banking practices, and they may or may not be fair. But I mean, what I'm talking about is the fact that you can have the criminal activity where the banking laws are altogether thrown out. The rules are thrown out if you're a big enough drug cartel or a big enough terrorist organization, because in the billions of dollars, the bank is happy to do the illegal activity and to make the profit from it. That's the point. I mean, I think that certainly a bank like HSBC, the profit, the unrecognized profit from illegal activities is probably one of the major sources of revenue for the bank. And certainly the off-the-books part of that, where the branch managers through the branch management are raking off cash personally, making loans to accounts and then defaulting on the accounts, that's activity that probably even the money launderers, the drug cartel doesn't itself realize is going on. So you got a lot of secondary account crime going on once these accounts are created by people in the bank who figure out new scams they can run on the fraudulent accounts.
Michael, thanks for the call. And by the way, if you do find opening a savings account, you get 1 or 2%, you better grab it because most are giving 1/10 of 1%.
I guess.
Our final call, Dan in Wisconsin. Go ahead. We have a short time left. You're on the air.
Yeah, I would like to know what the connection between China and this HSBC. My wife and I are going to Hong Kong in the first of the year, and we noticed on the currency that HSBC is in big, bold letters. Is that the Federal Reserve of China?
In a sense, it's one of the major banks in China. Essentially, it operates much like a central bank. It isn't a central bank, but it operates like one. It's a very different banking system in China, but this is a Chinese bank with a holding company headquarters in London.
We are out of time. Dan, thanks for the call. Dr. Corsi, thanks for being with us today, WND.com. But Dr. Corsi, thanks for the investigative work that you've done here on this story.
Thanks, great honor and pleasure to be with you.
Dr. Jerome Corsi has been with us here today on Crosstalk. Again, you can read the scenario of articles that started earlier this year and now last week, a settlement announced. But folks, this has implications for all of us. Thanks for joining us today on Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Take Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208, or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.